I'm Daniel Canstrom. I'm on the faculty here at the law school, and I'm the faculty director of the Rappaport Center for Law and Public Policy here at Boston College. And I welcome you on behalf of myself, our executive director, Lucy Medvedow, our assistant director, Abby Chingo, and everybody else who's a part of this organization, our board and our extended family and community. We've had some really engaging programming this year. The last panel that we had, which I think many of you attended, was about civil Gideon with a focus on judicial questions and questions of rights and the Bill of Rights and state constitutional rights and how we understand various aspects of the rule of law. Today, we're shifting to the political. This is part of the mandate of the Rappaport Center. It is about both law and public policy. I would submit that there is probably no question that's more crucial to law and public policy and to the bridge between law and public policy than that of democracy, and more specifically that of fair elections and peaceful transfers of power. Everybody knows how stressed a subject that's been in this country for the last few years. So it's incredibly important that we were able to do this panel, and I'm incredibly grateful to our moderator and our panelists. We have a wonderful panel for you today, and I'm going to stop talking in a second because I want to leave the maximum amount of time for that to happen. So my role will be to introduce our moderator, who is also our senior fellow, the second senior fellow we've had this semester, and she will be with us for a little bit more time. If anybody wants to meet with her, you can certainly do that, and you should take advantage of that. By this, I'm talking primarily to students. That's part of the idea of the Senior Fellow program, was to bring in people who are doing cutting edge work at the highest level and to have our students be able to engage with them, both in these kind of big formal settings, but also in one-on-one settings. So that's part of the program. Take advantage of it. And I know that she's been very generous with her time so far, and I'll take the presumption of saying that she will continue to be so, and happy to do it. So our senior fellow and our moderator for today is Genevieve Nadeau, who is counsel and impact manager with the nonpartisan and nonprofit Protect Democracy. She leads a team of lawyers and policy advocates and other professional staff to develop litigation, policy, and communications strategies to defend the rule of law, and I would say the best principles of the rule of law, guard against democratic decline, and secure accountability for abuses of power. Before that, she led the policy work of the National Task Force on Election Crises during the 2020 election, as well as Project Democracy's work to reform the Electoral Count Act. She's a lecturer at Harvard Law School, where she periodically co-teaches a course entitled Democracy and the Rule of Law. It's a clinic, actually, and related seminars. Prior to that, Genevieve served in the office of the Massachusetts Attorney General, where she was chief of the Civil Rights Division, among other positions. She oversaw many civil rights initiatives, litigated enforcement matters in a wide variety of arenas, and has dealt with such issues as wide-ranging as human trafficking, marriage equality, race-conscious college admissions, fair housing, pay equity, and military service by transgender service members. I'm going to stop there. There's a lot more, and you should get to know her to find out more about it, but we're lucky to have her. I'm going to turn it over to her to introduce our equally stellar array of panelists, and then we'll have the presentation. We will have some time for Q&A. If you haven't gotten food yet, although it looks like everybody has gotten food so far, but there is more food. So let's welcome Genevieve Nadeau.
Hi, everyone. And welcome to our panelists. I don't know if you can tell, but the crew here is enjoying some barbecue. So, all right, it's great to be back here. You hear okay? Okay. I'm going to introduce our panelists. I just want to start by saying, it's like every election cycle, we hear lots of hyperbole about the importance of the election, right? But I think in the current moment that we're in, following a fiercely contested election in 2020, the events of January 6th, 2021, I think this election may well live up to the hype in one way or the other. Last week, I spoke quite a bit about the stakes of the election for our democracy, and there's certainly been a lot of coverage of that in the news media. But before we can get to that, we have to get through the election period, right? From election day in November to inauguration on January 20th. So I'm very glad to have our panelists with us today. I've been lucky to work with all three. So let me introduce them. In no particular order, I'm going to start with Leigh Chapman, who is on the top left of your screen. So Leigh is the Division Director for Pro-Democracy Alliance and Structural Reform at Open Society Foundations. She, in 2022 and 2023, served as the Acting Secretary of State for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, pretty important state in the last election and the next. Leigh's also had a distinguished career as a civil rights attorney, including, among other things, serving as Executive Director of an organization called Deliver My Vote, and as a Senior Director of the Voting Rights Program for the Leadership Conference. And early in her career, among other things, served as the Director of Policy for the Pennsylvania Department of State. And Leigh's background is much broader than that. In fact, I'm going to give a short introduction of each of our panelists, but I encourage folks here to go online and read their full bios. Okay, so next we have Ben Ginsberg. Ben is currently the Volker Distinguished Visiting Fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution and the co-chair of not one, but two nonprofit organizations, the Pillars of the Community and the Election Officials Legal Defense Network. Ben has a long career representing candidates, elected officials, and others in the political process, including representing 4 of the last 6 Republican presidential nominees. And that includes serving as national counsel in the year 2000 and 2004 for the Bush-Cheney presidential campaign. He was a partner at Jones Day and at the law firm Patton Boggs for many years. And fun fact that I didn't know about Ben is that before going to law school, he actually served as a reporter at the Boston Globe. Yeah. Okay, and then last but not least, Professor Justin Levitt teaches at Loyola Law School, where he focuses on constitutional law and the law of democracy. From 2021 to 2022, he served in the White House as the first ever senior policy advisor for democracy and voting rights. He's also served in the federal government at the Department of Justice as the department's Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division. He also has a long career serving in a variety of capacities on presidential campaigns. He was the National Voter Protection Council in 2008. And before joining Loyola, he worked at several nonprofits doing civil rights and civil liberties work, including the Brennan Center for Justice. So thank you and welcome to all of our panelists. Okay, we're going to start by giving each of the panelists about 5 minutes or so to say a little bit about their work, and then we'll jump into some questions. So I'm going to start, why don't we go in the same order? Leigh, are you okay if we start with you?
Yes, that's fine.
Go ahead, the floor is yours.
So what do you want me to talk about? Sorry, what's the prompt?
Just a few minutes about your current work.
Okay, sure. So currently I work at Open Society Foundations. It's one of the nation's largest foundations in the world, actually, and I oversee our democracy work at Open Society Foundation. So that really involves planning for 2024 and also planning for 2025 and various scenarios and outcomes that could happen in the after the 2024 election. So for 2024, we've made significant investments in elections infrastructure, so voter registration, voter mobilization, voter turnout. We've also have invested in what I'm sure we're going to talk a lot about today is responding to potential election threats. So as far as our strategy is concerned, we looked at what are some novel threats that could occur in the 2024 election. So earlier this year, there was a lot on AI and democracy and the fact that this presidential election is the first one with generative AI. So we've made some investments to make sure that we're preventing widespread of voter disinformation in this election, and that organizations are also pushing on platforms to make sure they're preventing disinformation related to the election system. So that's one new investment we made for 2024. We also have made some significant investments with preventing election sabotage and really protecting that crucial vote count post-election period. As you probably will hear today, that election day is really the last day we vote. Voting has happened. I voted last week in Pennsylvania. I live in Philadelphia. But a lot of times, the vote isn't counted. Some places like Pennsylvania can't even start counting or canvassing vote by mail ballots until election day. So, it takes a while to get election returns, and counties actually certify the results. They send those to the Secretary of State, who then the governor then certifies and what have you. So protecting that count, making sure that organizations are prepared for various scenarios that could happen post-election is something that we've invested in. We've invested in a lot of organizations like Protect Democracy and others that are doing critical work to make sure that the vote is counted and cast properly. And, another thing that we've focused on this year is just making sure that our grantees and activists and organizations have proper access to cybersecurity assistance, physical security assistance, crisis communications, because we've seen nonprofit organizations are now under attack and under more scrutiny than ever. There have been subpoenas that organizations have received from investigative committees and oversight committees in the House. Unfortunately, a lot of our grantees that are activists who are in the movement now travel with physical security. And that's something that we've seen a ramp up, post January 6th and this year. So we've invested significant resources to make sure that people who are doing the work to make sure our democracy is protected have those resources to make sure that they're protected as well.
Great. Thank you, Leigh. We'll come back to your time in the Secretary of State's office.
Sure.
Why don't we go to Justin next?
Sure, and happily. And thanks, Genevieve, to you and to all the folks at BC for pulling us together, and to all the students enjoying the barbecue, and to my fellow panelists. So as you heard from my bio, I've had the privilege to work on elections wearing a few different hats, on campaigns, for nonprofits, both partisan nonprofits and nonpartisan ones, for government, both at the DOJ and the White House, at big tech, and now sort of back at my steady job as a law professor. In every role, in every one of those roles, my focus has really been on the process, trying to make sure that if you're eligible, you can vote a ballot that's meaningful and that it sticks. And that focus has often come with a particular emphasis on underserved communities, in part because that's where the greatest needs are. But in that work, I've had the privilege to both represent and sue election officials of both major parties and neither, and those whose partisan affiliations I still don't know, in part because the work on process really doesn't care all that much about candidate preference. It's designed to make sure that the preferences work for the voters and that they're able to express who they prefer to elect, and that the system reliably delivers those results. And the good news, I think, I'm sure we'll get to this, is that an awful lot of work, including an awful lot of work from the other colleagues with whom I've had the great good fortune to cross paths in past election work, and for whom I have the utmost admiration and respect. The good work has delivered a system that is strained and stretched and stressed, but remarkably robust. The 2020 election was the most scrutinized in history. It happened to deliver a reliable election in the middle of a pandemic, not by happenstance, but by an awful lot of work to make sure that the process reliably delivers results. And most of the work that I'm doing now is helping to explain that, helping to help people understand the ways in which the process is resilient, the ways in which belts and suspenders work to translate the people's preferences into results. I'm offering a bit of advice and institutional support for nonprofits that are helping voters, and a bit of advice and institutional support for nonprofits that are helping election officials. I'm not alone in that respect. You heard already from Leigh. I'm sure you'll hear from Ben. We're very much engaged in similar efforts, even if they're focused on different particular communities. I've been doing a bit of recruiting at Loyola and elsewhere to help students serve as poll workers. I'm very proud of our program that cancels classes on election day so that our students can actually go out into the community and serve at the polls. And we're going to have a few hundred students who are fanning out across the region to do exactly that, some at the polls, some working with nonpartisan poll monitoring groups. And I'm doing a bit of planning for the future because, as you heard from Leigh, election work is never done. And planning for the next and the next and the next and systemic support for election administration is always underway, even as the current elections take place. So even in the midst of a hotly contentious, highly contested election and election process, work happens not only to secure the election that, as Leigh said, is underway now. I was going to say is going to take place in a month, but is taking place as we speak, but also working to make sure that the process stays robust and resilient for next year and beyond. And I'm sure we'll get into more of the specifics about how and why in just a sec.
Thank you, Justin. Ben, welcome. Floor is yours. Oh, you're muted, Ben.
Can't hear.
See if we.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. And it's great to be on a panel with Justin and Leigh, who I have worked with in the past. And it's really a pleasure to be on with you. So the work I'm doing in this election cycle with the two nonprofits, the Election Official Legal Defense Network and the Pillars of the Community, is really rooted in the 40 or so years I spent as a very partisan Republican election lawyer. And in contested elections, which we certainly had a lot of, you really learn to see the value of the vote and the value of the peaceful transfer of power and the basic principles that undergird our country and form of government. I was part of the 2000 Florida recount with Governor Bush and Al Gore. And these days, conversations often turn to the great differences between them. Recognize that in 2000, it was 537 votes separating two candidates in an outcome determinative state. That really is a close election. And the candidates have absolute right to contest the election, to bring recounts, to litigate, and those rights were thoroughly exercised in Florida. But at the end of the day, Al Gore did one of the most courageous things and personally difficult things any candidate could do, which was to properly concede defeat after the processes said that George W. Bush was elected president. And when you compare that to 2020, which honestly was not a close election, and which the principle of the rule of law is that you have every right to bring court cases and recounts and litigation, but part of the rule of law is accepting the results, is very different from where we are today. So the work this cycle that I think all of us and many others are doing is really designed to preserve that institution of American elections. The appreciation for election officials and election administrators is something that I think people took for granted until the turmoil of 2020. I mean, Leigh knows this as a former election administrator. Justin is certainly seated up close. Genevieve works with election officials all the time. I was fortunate in 2013 and 2014 to co-chair a presidential commission with my Democratic colleague, Bob Bauer, that looked at problems with the 2012 election, specifically along lines, but it got much more into how you can make it easier for voters to vote while still having appropriate security measures so that people have public confidence in elections. And in the course of that, Bob and I were fortunate enough to work with many election officials over the country. And I think that for a couple of partisan lawyers who had more often than not been suing and fighting with election administrators, we both developed a huge level of admiration for what election officials go through. So fast forward to what we saw in 2020 and what we face in 2024. And so the Election Officials Legal Defense Network provides pro bono legal services. We recruit lawyers in private practice to represent election officials who are in need of legal services and not getting the support that they feel is adequate from their county and state lawyers. And so that's one phase of it. And the message of that organization to election officials is we have your back. But let me say, it is an organization that should not have to exist, and we are far busier than we should be in dealing with the problems that election officials are going through. The second organization, the Pillars of the Community, really comes from what we heard from election officials after 2020, which is we kind of felt that we were out there alone, that in fact, people in communities really were not there to support us and the way we did elections. I don't think election officials ever blamed the community leaders because it honestly had not been necessary before 2020 as it was in 2020. And so the Pillars of the Community is in 5 of the most contentious election jurisdictions in the country, gathering community leaders from across the political spectrum who we asked to meet with election officials, kick the tires of the election system, talk about all the flaws they and members of their community see in the election system, and have the election officials answer their questions, give tours of their facilities, really go deep on all the safeguards in the 11 phases of the election system. And the lesson for that and the challenge for this election cycle is that we are a really divided country, that there is half the country, certainly a third of the country, that doesn't believe in the reliability of election results. And that is a crisis for our democracy, potentially, that I'm sure we will address today. But the message from all that is recognize how divided a country we are, and that the two bubbles, the red bubble and the blue bubble, do not talk to each other very much. And that phenomenon is much broader than just elections, but has a real impact on what we're going to be seeing in the next several months.
Great. Thank you all. And Ben, that's a great sort of bridge to some of what I spoke about last week in terms of the divisions in our country and the polarization, and yet the need for cross-partisan and cross-ideological work in order to preserve it. So I'm very glad that you're all doing that. I want to jump into some of how you're feeling about the risks and what makes you both concerned and optimistic. But just to make sure we're all sort of grounded in the same understanding, I wonder if one of you or multiple of you could just walk us through what are the key inflection points between now and hopefully we'll see a peaceful transfer of power on January 20th. Maybe Professor Levitt, maybe I'll call on you first.
I welcome the cold call. So I think the most important thing to know is the thing that Leigh already said first, is that we're voting now, right? It is election season. It's election month. It's really election month and a half. First ballots go out 45 days before the election, and they're long gone. And so the first inflection point is to realize that we all have the opportunity to cast ballots, depending on the state in which you're in, either right at the moment or over the course of the next 20 some days until election day. Election day is the next big moment, not because it's when most people vote, but because it's, as Leigh rightly put it, the end of that process. It's the last day to count ballots. The most important inflection point about election day is that no results are ever official on election day and have never been official on election day. When you hear the networks call states for various candidates, what they're doing is making a projection based on estimates, which are usually really good estimates informed by really good data about the way that things are likely to go. Most networks, most news organizations are, with the help of some of the people on this call, very responsible about that effort and won't call an election for a particular state, won't predict, won't estimate unless it's really 99.999% certain that the election is going to go that way. They'll hold back and say the election's too close to call in the following states. But all of that election night is just an estimate. So the next inflection point is states making that count official, actually counting the ballots, in some cases recounting the ballots, in some cases auditing the count of the ballots. That leads to a process called certification, or the canvass. And in most states, that's just math, taking the results in various precincts and adding them up so that we know which candidate seems to have won across a jurisdiction. That process happens for president just like it happens for every other office, local office, state legislative office, congressional office, etc. The deadlines for certification vary across the states, but they tend to be 2 to 3 weeks after election day-ish. Then there's a period, as Ben mentioned, in super close elections, candidates have the right to either ask for a recount to make sure that we got the count right, or to challenge those results if they feel there was something fundamentally unfair about them, not just fundamentally unfair in the air, but located in a particular statute or particular regulation that said something happened that shouldn't have. The next main inflection point is going to be the determination by the states of who won, particularly for president in those states. And now I'll shift over to the presidential timeline, although that is not the only race on the ballot this fall, not by a long shot. There's a new federal statute that says effectively states have to come up with a final answer by December 11th. Most states will have a final answer long before December 11th, but the deadline for the executive to say, okay, we now have a final answer is December 11th. That's to determine who the voters in the Electoral College are, who the electors are, driven by each state's rules for choosing electors. December 17th, those electors will cast their votes for president and vice president. And then Congress, the new Congress that begins its session on January 3rd, will count up the votes of those electors on January 6th. I will hope that all of this process is clear well before any of those dates I just mentioned, and that those dates are sort of official stamps and ceremonial as they have been in the past. But in 2020, we saw an awful lot of contestation right up until January 6th itself.
That is super helpful. Let me go around a little bit, but I'll start with you, Leigh. You served as the acting Secretary of State in a battleground state. So based on that experience, I'm curious what you are most concerned about in this election period, so it's not all dark. What makes you the most optimistic?
Great. So I'll start with the dark and the concern. And I think it's perfect because Justin just laid out the timeline, and I think the most clearest way I've ever heard it. So thank you for that, Justin. But I'm most concerned, as I mentioned before, about that post-election period during the certification process. And, certification, as Justin said, was really a ministerial act. It was, just certifying that the vote count was accurate. But now, in recent years, it's become very contentious. And I think, as it takes longer for votes to be counted because of more mail-ins or what have you, there's just more opportunity to sow doubt in the election process. And in 2022, when I was acting Secretary of State, a lot of election deniers used a provision in the Pennsylvania Election Code that was really unknown and never used before. And they filed petitions for recount across the state. And they filed them in over 20 counties. And under that provision, challengers only need to have 3 voters per precinct, and they need to pay $50 in order to ask a court to, review and consider having that jurisdiction do a recount. And because of the vast number of petitions, it really held up the certification process, because some judges just threw it out and said, there's no fraud or error here. These are baseless petitions. We're not going to even look at this. But some did require votes to be recounted, which takes time. And so there are delays. And in 2022, I didn't certify the election until December 27th. So if you think about it, that's past that deadline that Justin said, because there were these petitions for recount. Also, that was in the general election in November. In the primary election, we had this issue also around undated ballots, which is something that has continuously been litigated in Pennsylvania, where there was an issue around, voters signing and dating the back of the ballot. And there were 5 counties that just refused to count votes when voters forgot. Basically, the court said it was immaterial, the votes could be counted. Right now, the courts say don't count them. But anyway, at that time, at that snapshot in time, counties were supposed to count those ballots. 5 counties said no, they weren't going to. So I had to sue them to force the count. And anytime you have litigation, it takes longer, it delays certification. So I think that is a very real problem. In this election, delays to certification. You also recently saw in Georgia, the election board in Georgia decided to do hand counts of ballots. And anytime you do hand counts, it takes longer. You're also inserting more error because there's human error where machines are more efficient and more accurate. So that is a concern that I have for this election period. I guess the one plus that we have is, I think mail-in voting. I'm always a proponent of mail-in voting. I think it's efficient. I did it. I already voted last week, as I mentioned, with my family, and put it in the mail, and I already received a confirmation that my ballot was received. I think because of the pandemic and the fact that a lot of jurisdictions and voters use mail-in voting for the first time in 2020, it's not so new anymore. And election jurisdictions and local counties have the machinery to process those ballots faster. So I think that the vote count will go faster in 24. But the problem is, the certification issues and the challenges that people have really used 2022 to test. We're going to see that. I'm also concerned about political violence too, and just the fact that there are people in this country that might not want to, or a candidate in particular who might not want to accept the results of the election, and what that will do to our country as far as creating divides and potential political violence. And that goes back to that safety and security work that we're doing, that we're investing in at Open Society Foundations, and making sure that election administrators, as well as actual advocates and lawyers, have that safety and security they need to make sure that we have free and fair elections.
Thanks, Leigh. Okay, that's a lot. Ben, I'm curious what you think. Leigh highlighted a lot going on in the certification in particular, but what worries you? Is it that? Is it something else?
Well, I think it's what worries me the most is expectations that people have about what will come in that period, combined with the real polarization that's out in the country, especially in the most contentious jurisdictions. Let me pick up on what Justin said to describe a little bit what I mean. I think it is really unlikely in the 7 battleground states that will determine the presidential election that you're going to get results on election night. So in Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Nevada, I think only Michigan and North Carolina have changed laws over the last 4 years that may actually speed up elections. And in fact, policymakers in the other states, for a variety of reasons, have laws that if the results are tight, you're not going to know on election day. And just in looking at it, my guess is you're not going to really know who won if it's close until Saturday, the weekend afterwards. And so the real challenge is what happens in that period. What you did see in 2020 was that the time between results being called by the states, and Justin is absolutely right, they're not official till the certification, but the period between election night and the results being called is really where there's a lot of turmoil and churn and disinformation and misinformation. So it will be really important to be able to fact check and truth tell in that period about the rumors that are circulating and even some of the cases that are being filed. What I am optimistic about is the work that election officials have done to get ready for this. I do think that especially in the contested states, election officials have learned those lessons. They're not going to be surprised this time, but they will know much better how to refute disinformation, how to be transparent, and to try and convince people. A couple other dates to keep in mind that are inflection points in what we're going to see and have to deal with is that the 7 battleground states have their state certification of results between November 22nd in Georgia and December 2nd in North Carolina, with a bunch of the states right before Thanksgiving this year. So that's when you will know the totals that have been compiled on those dates. Now, there's still a period until December 11th, when on the presidential level, and this is only on the presidential level, the certificate of ascertainments go to determine the electoral college winners. And so that will be a fraught period. And then next until December 17th, when the electors actually meet in their states. Again, what I hope is the optimistic ray of light in this is that we do see on the community level, not on the national level, but on the community level, there are leaders of the communities who recognize that the peace and prosperity of their communities is much better off if there's not rioting in the streets over elections. And so that's something that I do see as an optimistic sign in what could be a contentious period.
Good. I like that. Justin, I'm going to ask you basically the same question, but I wonder if you can say a little bit more about what's changed between the last election in 2020 and the election now, and how that affects whether you're more concerned or less concerned.
Sure. So I think a couple things have changed. Now I'll take the same sort of start dark and hopefully a little bit lighter structure. One of the things that's changed is I think more actors realize how much money there is to be made in the turmoil and churn that Ben just talked about and that Leigh talked about before. And it's a reason that I share all of their concerns that the post-election period, not everywhere, but in a few places is likely to feel really noisy, in part because there are a lot of people that recognize now how much money there is to be made in that noise. I think that in the post-election period in 2020, from November to January, former President Trump's leadership PAC alone, just one entity, and this is, I got to stress, an entity that exists with very few regulatory guards on what the money raised can be spent on. It's not a campaign-related fundraising vehicle. It's not a litigation-related fundraising vehicle. It can be used for effectively whatever, including personal expenses. Raised almost $30 million in 2 months just based on messaging talking about litigation and fighting about the results of the election. And that's one entity. There were many entities in the post-election space, and I fear some of them have faced some accountability for misconduct, including misinformation, including hundreds of millions of dollars of damages judgments. That's a good thing. I think accountability is still coming, even though it's slow, necessarily. But many of them actually were rewarded. They figured out that they could profit, quite literally, from creating the churn. And so what's new is that people recognize how much money there is to be made in those pits, and they have a real incentive to foster noise and to foster chaos. My optimism is also based a little bit in a change since 2020 and a little bit in similarly proof of concept. So what you've heard from all of us is that we're worried about turmoil and tumult in the post-election period, which is serious in and of itself. But none of us have said that we're worried that the results that the results that the people have voted for in those swing states will in some ways, in any ways, change. And I think that's because, like them, I am very confident that we, the people on this call, that people in nonprofit spaces, foundation spaces, in litigation spaces, the lawyers aren't going to decide this election. The courts aren't going to decide this election. That the people are going to decide this election. That unless the vote is 537 votes close, as Ben mentioned, that the choices of the voters in swing states are actually going to drive who not only is elected, but who is inaugurated for president. And I say that because there's been some federal statutory change that has made that process bipartisan, by the way, emphatically bipartisan, federal statutory change that has made that process cleaner and clearer, helping to drive results that people can and should have confidence in. But also because we showed that despite, again, stress testing beyond anybody's wildest imagination, that despite stress testing the process in 2020, that the election, the most scrutinized election in American history, held. That the structures and processes are robust and resilient. And there's every reason to believe, as Ben said, that election officials are even more prepared this time under conditions that are maybe politically trickier, but in terms of implementation, right, we're not, thankfully, yet administering an election in the middle of a pandemic this time around. And changing all of the procedures that we had to use in order to make sure the election was fair weeks before election time. So I am very confident that the results will stick and that the election process will show itself again to be a process that we all should have confidence in. Despite the tumult, we're in charge of this one. The voters, the plane is engineered and maintained and fueled, and the runway is clear, and the air traffic control system is set. The plane is ready to take all of us wherever the pilot decides it should go. And that's a good thing. That's how the election should work.
I'm curious, Leigh and Ben, if you agree with the sort of bottom line assessment that notwithstanding the turmoil, that the end result will be a free and fair election that reflects what the voters have said at the ballot box. Ben, you're muted still.
I think it's too dark to disagree with that bottom line assessment. So I'm with Justin on that. I think there are more bumps in the road this time than there were in 2024, to be sure. And that third of the country that doesn't have faith in election results has hardened tremendously since 2020. And that is a big problem. And I agree completely with Justin about all the money to be made. But I think it's a fraud suppression industrial complex that we've got now, that the turnout models of both parties are geared towards sort of mobilizing their voters with really kind of harsh messages. And that takes place in both parties. And there's a lot of money being made in both parties and in the nonprofit community, to be perfectly clear, about really stressing the fraud suppression arguments for each side. And I think that's pretty problematic, both for long-term and for this election. And if I was going to urge the pro-democracy community, which we all partake, on one thing, there was a really bad mistake made over the last 4 years in not doing more outreach. And there are exceptions to this, but not doing more outreach to the people who are skeptical about elections. That the bubbles of the country have been perpetuated by far too many entities sort of in the political parties and in the nonprofit communities too.
Leigh, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I'm curious if you want to pick up on any of that. In particular, that Ben's last point, you served in one of those roles where part of your job is to help educate, right, your constituents. What do you think about that?
Yeah, just to pick up on something that we've been thinking about a lot at Open Society Foundations is how to have like a resilient democracy in our country right now. And it's going to take a really broad-based coalition in order to achieve that. So we've been really working at making sure that, we are supporting like the business community that wants to take a stand and support democracy, conservatives, people who are movement leaders, people who are in the faith community. Like we're really trying to make sure that there is a larger tent across various ideologies that is thinking about the importance of our institutions, how we preserve democracy, and are working together to make sure that happens. And, we're a global foundation. We have offices all over the world. So we've been having some really in-depth conversations and learnings with some of our colleagues and leaders in Poland and in France, just to hear about how they've had, recent elections that have also been contentious and what they've done in order to come on the side of democracy. So that's something that is more of a long-term play as opposed to just this election. But I'm really encouraged to see that, we're having these bipartisan conversations like today. We're doing more work with people from various sectors. Businesses are now starting to speak out and say they want stability, right? They're on the side of democracy. So we've made a lot of progress since 2020 on that front with making sure that there is a larger tent across various sectors and ideology focused on democracy.
Let me pick up on that, and also something, Ben, that you said during your opening remarks about the level of polarization. And I think we do have a little bit of push-pull in that we are seeing efforts to build a broader tent, but also we're seeing folks more polarized than they have been in some time. But one of the things that makes me feel at least somewhat more optimistic about this election is that we have learned some lessons. We've actually learned quite a few lessons and made some improvements. I think a few folks have touched on the Electoral Count Act, right, which is 1887, right? I got the right year, 1887, when it was originally passed in the wake of the Hayes-Tilden election. It sort of worked in the background as a sort of old clunky statute, and it was really at the center of many efforts to overturn the last election. And so since then, it took Congress 10 years after the Hayes-Tilden election to come up with the statute in the first place, but then just 2 after the last to reform the statute. And it's certainly not going to fix everything, but we do have I think a stronger sort of federal infrastructure for the process of counting and counting electoral votes. The reason I come back to that is, Ben, I'm curious, because I know you've worked very closely on that. Why, in this sort of very polarized environment, why was there bipartisan support for that bill? How did that happen?
Because it was a unique bill, because neither side could figure out how to game it for a political advantage. There was clearly something broken, but the Electoral Count Reform Act deals with a situation where neither party could know in advance if their candidate was ahead or behind. Neither candidate could know for certain for future elections who the vice president was going to be, which party. And so it was a rare moment where, neither party could figure out how to get political advantage out of it. Everyone knew that there would be a problem, and so it was a shining, glorious moment of bipartisan compromise, but I'm not sure how capable of repetition it is.
If I can add just a hot second to that, the new statute is really a fire extinguisher of sorts. It's a break glass in case of emergency. It sets up a structure, but most of the time it's wholly unnecessary, right? Or at least it should be wholly unnecessary. The act does its most work when there's a real breakdown in the process somewhere. And I think there were multiple breakdowns in the process somewhere. And I think there was this bipartisan momentum that Ben talked about, which, yes, is rare and exceedingly welcome, in part because responsible leaders realized that when the house is on fire, it doesn't matter whether it's your wing of the house or somebody else's wing of the house is still on fire, and you still have to put it out because that fire grows to cause damage wherever it lands. That's, I think, a rare moment of institutional legislative clarity and a real response to some emergency conditions. I wish, like Ben, that it were more forthcoming more often. But I think it's useful to note that push comes to shove. As in 2020, most of the institutions stood, despite a lot of bad behavior by some individuals. Most of the institutions stood. And I think this act was another example of institutions actually behaving in an adult way that we don't see as often as I'd like.
It was a unique sort of confluence of events and interests. And like I said, I think one of the high points in the last few years, at least in this area. But you just had mentioned emergencies, Justin. And so I'm curious from anyone who wants to jump in. We just saw a pretty massive hurricane where states are still trying to recover. We have another one barreling its way towards Florida. How ready are states, particularly, there's natural disasters, there's other things that may be coming, but how ready do you think states are with that kind of thing in mind?
Well, I think it varies a great deal among states. And I think especially the battleground states have done a really good idea trying to gameplay out everything that you can. But it's the black swan events that you can't game out that are really a problem. So I think North Carolina has done a remarkable job in recovering, and absentee mail balloting, it started already. They've really, I think, taken all sorts of extraordinary steps to get that situation in place so it will be a valid and good election. But the question is, what happens if that hurricane had come a month later? And that, of course, makes is a real challenge for election officials. So better prepared, but better prepared for what? If any of you were Succession fans and saw the fire in the absentee ballot center on election night that destroyed perhaps the margin of victory, that's kind of the event that you can never plan for and have to deal with. So I think that all the states have procedures in place, and you just have to hope it covers the black swan event if it comes.
You have a lot of smiles and nods in the room on the Succession reference. Leigh, what do you think?
I was just going to say that, there are a lot of tabletop exercises that election officials, go through. And there's partnerships with like the emergency management agencies in each state. There's partnerships with law enforcement. So there's a lot of careful coordination that happens in the months before the election and actually throughout, the year and with planning. So yes, there are these events that are unfortunate, but as Ben said, that, people are planning for it. And so I think that's a really significant point to make.
And I think it helps that the standard, the public communication of the standard may be different than the actual standard we should expect. So I think the question in this arena is not, is the election going to go perfectly? Or can we prevent all of the mistakes? Or can we prevent all of the glitches? But how do we respond when inevitably the mistakes or glitches come? And that's where the system is really wonderfully resilient, with lots of belts and lots of suspenders, not to prevent all of the problems in the first place, but in responding to them quickly and accurately so that the election's free and fair. And there's far more involved in that system than I think most people recognize. And that means not a greater tolerance for error, but flexibility, enough sort of welcome give to be able to make sure that the errors don't affect the results, or that the problems don't affect the results, that the system works despite things that come along the way.
So before we turn it over to our audience with questions, let me ask, there's a couple more I want to get to. So one is, let's talk about Congress. Right, lots to say about Congress, but in particular, January 6th, what is sort of in and out of bounds? And we have two potential results, Harris victory or Trump victory. Can you say a little bit about what the role of Congress is, and maybe what you're looking for them to do or not to do? Our newly sworn in members of Congress, right, who have been, at least in some respect, there for 3 days.
Yeah, really a great question. I can't wait to hear Justin's answer on it. So the new Congress is sworn in on January 3rd. You've all read the polls about how close the race for Congress is, that it really is up in the air who'll win. The first order of business on January 3rd is electing a speaker. There's at least some recent history in which the majority party has had kind of a challenge in electing a speaker. I think one of those, you never know what would happen, events is the House can't come up with a speaker. There is no speaker. Can the House go into session? That'll drive the parliamentarians crazy for the next few months. So is there actually a session on January 6th as required by the Constitution? So Congress's role in all of this, especially as amplified by the Electoral Count Reform Act, is to ministerially open the certificates from the states, total up the numbers, and sign off on it. But as we've also seen, there have been that procedure, those guardrails have not always been kept in place, or at least attempts to get rid of it. So I think Congress's role, as I read the statutes and the Constitution, is that they're signing off on the numbers, with a couple of really small exceptions that you would not expect to have come up.
Yeah, I think that's right. And most importantly, I think Congress's role on January 6th, Congress's role in the election process, is to give an adult stamp to the results that will, by that point, have been abundantly clear across the country. It's, as Ben says, to count up the totals and say, yes, 2 + 2 actually equals 4. And there has been, I think, profound amounts of misbehavior by some members of Congress who don't take that role as seriously as they should. But the institution as a whole has so far responded pretty well when the stakes are down, when things are really serious. And that is because I think the institution as a whole knows that it's the people's representative body that keeps democracy. And staring that in the face is sobering. And it really causes people to think about why they are occupying the seats that they're occupying. That's another part of why I think I have faith that the process is going to work out in delivering the election results to whomever wins. And I don't have a preconception about who that's going to be. Because I think although there are some bad actors inclined to use their platforms to create trouble, I don't think that amounts to a majority of either House of Congress. And I don't think the results on in November that are validated on January 3rd, when the new Congress is seating, are going to change that. The new Electoral Count Reform Act made it a little bit more difficult to create problems, for bad actors to create problems. So it raised the threshold to create noise and disturbance. And I think that too is a good thing. It means that you don't have the possibility of 1 or 2 members making trouble, that they have to convince a far more sizable size of the caucus to make trouble. And that's going to be, I think, harder to come by when people understand the consequences.
You use the word adult in Congress in the same sentence, but I otherwise agree with your answer. Leigh, you want to jump in? Is there anything that's on your mind with respect to Congress and the January 6th?
No, but you know, just as I mentioned before, I just think that we should just be prepared for you know, possible instances of political violence during that period, which I know Justin and Ben did mention, which is unfortunate, but I think we're more prepared this time than we were before, so.
I think I tend to agree with the sort of bottom line assessment and, you know, where we'll end up after this process. But I do think there's a fair amount of damage that is done to our institutions and the people's faith in those institutions and our democracy writ large when we see shenanigans in that immediate post-election period and in Congress. So there's, on the one hand, yes, I think we'll be okay in the big picture, but it really does damage when members of Congress stand up and challenge clearly legitimate results, like from states in Pennsylvania. So we will see. I think it's going to be a long period. One last question. Speaking of folks in Congress, many of whom are lawyers, you're all lawyers. Curious, just for your reflections for this group of law students primarily, on sort of the role of lawyers in this time frame. Feel free to jump in.
No, I would just start by saying, you know, I feel like my interest in voting rights and election law and civil rights really harkens back to when I was a law student at Howard University School of Law. You know, I participated in voter protection efforts on the partisan side, and then also later did it on the nonpartisan side, volunteering for the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights under law. So there's a lot of opportunities for law students to, you know, get involved, to be poll monitors, to be, you know, you can do it on the partisan side or the nonpartisan side, and just really help people understand the process of voting, how they can get information. You know, you can man voter hotlines, and I've done that many years. And the number one question people usually say is like, where's my polling place? How do I vote? You know, it's very simple questions, and you feel like you're helping do your part to make the political process work. So I would encourage, you know, law students to volunteer. You know, as you're thinking through internships, there's so many organizations that Open Society Foundations and our grantee partners fund that provide excellent opportunities for law students to intern in the summer or during the school year. I highly recommend that if you're interested in election law at all, you know, you volunteer or you know, get a paid internship working for one of those organizations. It's a wonderful way for you to network, meet people in the field, learn about what's happening. And it's really hard to kind of get your foot in the door without relationships, and that's everything. So, you know, having that internship opportunity helps you if you want to apply for a permanent position after you graduate and once you've passed the bar. And, you know, lawyers, there's so many election lawsuits that are happening. If you're interested, I would encourage you to subscribe to the election law blog, Democracy Docket. We're at the period where election cases and lawsuits are fast and furious. And, you know, one state might have a law in their books one day, and it might change the next day based on a court law or order, and it really will determine how votes are counted. So if you're interested, you know, I would encourage you to look online and subscribe to these newsletters so you're in touch with like the late breaking news, because it's quite exciting as far as how quickly things can change as we get closer to Election Day.
Thank you. Ben, what do you think? You've been at the heart of many election contests as a lawyer. What do you think about this cycle?
Well, one of my colleagues had the really excellent point that in an election like this that has so much interest, every lawyer is an election lawyer in this period, just because you're going to be asked by your friends and colleagues. You have many opportunities to get involved, whether on a partisan basis or being a poll worker, and you should take and you should take full advantage of that. In this cycle, which is going to be contentious, I think that lawyers really need to be guided by the rule of law, which means a couple of things. First of all, the laws do provide the ability for candidates to file recounts, contests, and litigation. And the system, our system, works best if the parties involved are really well represented. So it is the obligation of every lawyer to represent clients and to do your best for them. So lawyers who represent the opposite side from yours are not inherently bad people for disagreeing with you on this. The essence of the rule of law is that even the most unpopular people have good counsel. Having said that, the lesson to be learned from 2020 is, by God, you got to have evidence if you're going to bring a case. And bringing a case just because your team jersey demands that you do that is very wrong under the rule of law. You have to be sure there's real evidence involved. And then lastly, after you're in those hotly contested litigations, and there will be this time, you have to accept the outcome. That's part of the bargain. If you go in and you file the cases, you are agreeing to the system and accepting the outcome. And that didn't happen after 2020. And that's an obligation that I think lawyers need to keep in mind for 2024.
That's great. Justin, you want to do, if you have a quick answer, and then Lissy is going to pass the microphone around to some of our students in the room.
I will make this very quick. So I got, on Ben's last point, I got internet famous for about 30 seconds in 2020 explaining to people that a lawsuit without provable facts of an actual violation of law is just a tweet with a filing fee. But most Americans don't understand that. They're used to something about the law. They've been trained by pop culture to believe in sort of magical legalism, that if you say the right words in Latin in the right order, you can cast a spell and something magical happens on the other side. You all know better, and your training helps you know better. Law is just a dispute resolution system. It works exactly as Leigh and Ben have pointed out, and you understand what the law can do and what it can't do. It can't magic away the votes of millions of people to achieve a different result than what the people have intended. And so helping your friends and family and colleagues and peers understand that is an enormously valuable function, that you speak a language that other people don't necessarily speak and therefore don't understand. And helping to demystify a little bit what the law is and what it isn't is enormously useful to creating some of this cross-partisan, bipartisan faith in the institutional process that both Leigh and Ben talked about that we really need much more of. So don't underestimate your role sitting around the table at Thanksgiving in helping people understand what the heck is going on, and even more important, what's not going on, what the law is not doing, because that's not what the law exists in order to do. That's not what it's for.
That's a great, if you have a question from a student?
I do. We will open it up to Q&A, and I happen to know we have a question.
Thank you for being here. For the last 8 to 9 years, we've seen the role foreign actors and governments play in influencing our elections and how people view our elections. How are these efforts shaping up, and what's the best way to combat foreign influence over how we see the credibility of the results?
Anyone want to jump in on that?
So I'll take a quick stab and then invite others to participate. You're right to trace it, at least the concern, the national concern, back 8, 9 years. It didn't start then by any stretch. But 8, 9 years ago, I think there was a lot of concern that foreign actors would manipulate the process, would drive a different outcome, would hack the elections. And I think what we saw is that it is the resilience of the election process and the resistance, the fact that the election process is prepared for that sort of administration-based hacking, right? The concern was they get into the voter registration systems, they get into the machines, they manage to change the results in some way. None of that happened. Instead, what we saw in 2016 is they recognized that the weak link is human. And so they hacked us, the American people. They amplified some of the disagreements we already had. They engaged in messaging in order to foster distrust. Now, unfortunately, the call's coming from inside the house, and we are hacking us. Again, not the systems, but the people, and amplifying our own disagreements and fostering distrust in elections. And foreign actors are only too happy to stoke those fears. So I think the highest point of resilience and resistance to manipulation doesn't actually come from the systems or the machines or the processes. Those are pretty robust in a lot of places. They come in making sure we understand where information is coming from fact checking our sources a little bit, and even more from gut checking the information that we come from with each other. We are most susceptible to attempts to influence the process when we're acting in isolation. The pandemic dinged all of us up in that respect. Our networks to gut check what's real and what's not are pretty robust when we're actually using them. And so I think we just have to use them more often to see if the information we're getting is information that we think we believe in or can trust.
Thank you. We have other questions? We have a microphone working its way across.
Perspectives, as is.
There you go. Okay.
Thank you so much to all three of you for joining us today, and really appreciated you all being able to articulate how critical the goal is of trusting the accuracy of the next election. But I also wanted to ask about another goal that people have for our elections, which is the ability of people that are eligible to vote and want to vote, that they are able to exercise that right, and that, you know, there are lots of reforms out there, including expanding mail-in voting or same-day voter registration that have the potential to impact that. Are those goals that you guys see as complementary or in tension with that, you know, the accuracy of the election? And are there ways that those two can and should move forward together?
Sure, I can take that. Yes, I mean, as far as our position at Open Society Foundations and a position I've had in prior roles, especially at the Leadership Conference, which is the largest civil rights coalition in the country. And we were lobbying on behalf of some of these reforms in Congress. You know, my personal position is, you know, people need to have all the options in order to cast their ballot. The more options, the more turnout, the more participation. So that includes same-day voter registration, automatic voter registration. And there's a few bills in Congress that you've probably heard of, or you will hear of in 25, depending on who wins the election. The For the People Act, which is the legislation that would create more national standards for elections, because remember, there's over 10,000 election jurisdictions in our country, and elections are run various ways based on what state you live in, which county you live in. So not everybody has the same access to the ballot. So that bill is to really level the playing field to make sure that everyone has 2 weeks of early voting, that there is same-day registration, there is universal mail-in voting. It has other provisions too around redistricting and what campaign finance reform and what have you. So depending on who wins in 25, I'm sure that bill will be revisited and changed to also reflect some current issues around the courts, what have you. But that's something that we're supportive of is the expansion and the ability for, in particular, voters who have been historically marginalized and shut out of the process to be able to vote. And that also goes into restoring the Voting Rights Act too, which is another bill that you probably will hear of. It's the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which is an effort to restore the core provision of the Voting Rights Act that was stripped with the Shelby County versus Holder decision. And that basically would prevent jurisdictions that a history of voting discrimination from passing restrictive laws. So that's our position, but I'm sure others on this panel have other positions on that. So
Ben, I'm curious, I think it's a false choice, my personal view, between increasing access and accuracy. But I'm curious, Ben, when you think about that sort of tension that the question highlighted.
I don't think there is an inherent tension in there, but I think Leigh is right about the 10,000 jurisdictions in the country. You know, we made a decision way back when that control of elections should be on a really local basis. And so there are consistency problems throughout the country. And everything is not equal, and you would prefer to have it that way. Let me say that the For the People Act and the John Lewis Act are, from my perspective as a Republican, really partisan bills designed to lock in the Democratic Party's electoral advantage. It is what legislators do when they get control. They put in bills under sort of lofty rhetoric, but they are designed both by Republicans passing the laws they pass in state legislatures and what the For the People Act, really the For the Democratic People Act, tries to do in locking in a political advantage for its side. So I think there are any number of measures that could be taken to both improve voting access and to give people reassurance that elections are accurate. And part of the reason you now have 30% or a third of the country not believing in the reliability of election results is that this issue has become a partisan club by both parties to try and gain an electoral advantage. And while there are many well-meaning people who actually believe in the individual provisions of it, you've got to depoliticize this area. And if you pass election bills, one party passes it without bipartisan support, that only goes to further the divide in the country, which is what I think is the greatest peril that we face.
So as you might imagine, there is in fact a diversity of opinions on this panel. Let me just say one thing about the current moment we're in that will be, I think, another path to optimism. So political science is pretty clear that to the extent there are burdens in the election process, they fall incrementally on infrequent voters who also tend to be sort of at the socioeconomic ends of the process. And to the extent that there are provisions to expand access, that they incrementally help infrequent voters. And I think it's fair to say that Democratic and Republican jurisdictions serving their own voters have found a variety of ways to expand access without compromising accuracy or security. That you have some provisions that seem like they've been cast in a Democratic pitch or Republican pitch nationally that you'll find Republican or Democratic jurisdictions locally adopting because they serve their own electorates. One of the things that Donald Trump is unquestionably credited with doing is bringing back a raft of infrequent voters to the Republican Party, increasing the Republican Party's appeal to infrequent voters. And I think that that brings with it a lot of potential, because I think to the extent there ever was a disparity in probably more the conventional wisdom than the actual fact of what political preference infrequent voters have, I think that Donald Trump is changing the conventional wisdom to help people realize that access provisions that allow infrequent voters a little bit of assistance with a system they're unfamiliar with, make it easier for people to vote when they haven't always been regular voters, actually help local voters, whomever they choose to vote for, whether that's Republicans or Democrats. And I think that insight, slow in sort of displacing the gut sense that many elected officials have about how that works. But I think that insight is actually going to help further improvements to the process going forward. Because I think people will recognize that the improvements are unlikely to be felt in a partisan way. I think they're likely to reflect whatever partisan preferences local voters have.
Thank you, Professor. That was well done. I think we have time for one more question from the audience and looking around. Or you can't see, but Lissy is furiously running back and forth between the students.
Thanks very much. My question has to do about kind of the use of political violence as a strategy. And what is being done, well, it's almost become kind of a mundane strategy. You hear about Mitt Romney paying $5,000 to basic security, but then you see like what happened to Moss and Friedman, the election workers in Georgia when they were targeted, and the horrible ordeal they went through with much less resources. What's being done both to hold people account that are making those violent threats against such workers on one hand, and then two, kind of putting protections in place for them so they can feel safe in doing their important work.
Ben or Leigh, you want to start us off?
Well, I think local jurisdictions are doing a great deal to improve, I think as Leigh said before, their relationships with law enforcement, so that in 2020, I don't think there were really protocols for when to call for help, and I think there are much more now. We certainly tried to do our part with the Election Officials Legal Defense Network. And thirdly, I say one of the kind of mysteries to me is why the Justice Department, and maybe Justin can answer this, has not brought more prosecutions. There are some, to be sure, but there are an awful lot more threats than there are prosecutions going on. And that's a public policy question that I'm not sure I understand the answer to.
Leigh, you've been in the hot seat yourself. What do you think about the question?
Yeah, that I agree with what Ben was saying, and I had my own security detail. I didn't have it when I started off as Secretary of State, but as I was making decisions and issuing guidance and suing counties, that's when things started ramping up, and it did lead to the point where I needed to get my own security detail. And one thing that is important to note is post 2020, there was an influx of money from philanthropy to help with election. Well, during 2020, there was an influx of money from philanthropy to help election officials run elections and purchase equipment. And since then, a lot of legislatures around the country have banned the third-party use of funding for elections. So foundations like Open Society Foundation are no longer able to, give money to election officials for things like safety and security. So that actually has to be done through an official appropriation or, the state police. So that's who my detail was, a state police, but, there's some limitations when it comes to that too, as far as when you can have coverage. It varies based on every state and jurisdiction, but it's just something to note is that election officials, they're public servants and they might not have enough money to pay for their own security. So it's important that the local government or state government makes a conscious appropriation to make sure that they have the protection that they need. But as we receive threats, or as I received threats in 2022, we would simultaneously report them to the FBI and to the state police, and they would do their own investigations. They would consult with each other. But I do agree with Ben, is it's really hard to have a threat that gets to the threshold of prosecution. And so, it's hard to know, like, what could potentially arise to something that could be, a really devastating threat because people aren't prosecuted. So.
Justin, you want to wrap us up?
Yeah, so I'll add just a second of a thought on both of the things that Ben and Leigh said. Look, we could have an hour and a half on election funding itself. The funding model is broken, and there is no question that philanthropy was only ever the second best option. The best option is to make sure that government actually funds this essential process. And that has not been forthcoming anywhere near the degree that it needs to. That's something that should be a bipartisan focus, because that just, again, affects local election officials, whomever they're serving. That helps local election officials serve Democrats and Republicans and none of the above. And that needs to change. People need to actually demand that the election process be funded to provide the service that we expect. And it's not, including security. I agree entirely with Leigh and Ben that I too would like more prosecutions of some of the heinous threats that have come down election officials' way. Part of why Ben rightly says that there have been fewer than one might think is, as Leigh rightly said, the really high threshold that the First Amendment provides for what actually constitutes a criminally actionable threat, as opposed to, and there's a lot of room between something that makes election officials feel extremely uncomfortable and or fear for their safety, and what might constitute a criminally actionable threat based in part on the Supreme Court's jurisprudence. DOJ has been exceedingly cautious in that respect. I think part of that has a little bit to do with working the refs, right? They don't want to be seen as taking a political view, even as they prosecute these cases. I think even more could be done, frankly, and their approach has been head down, look at the facts, evaluate the law, see how the law fits the facts. And as Leigh said, there's a lot of room in between pretty awful facts, lawful but awful, and what they're able to prosecute. I think far more could be done to publicize the prosecutions they have brought, to make it clear to election officials that prosecutions will be brought in the most heinous of circumstances. And I think that's a real marketing problem that the DOJ has had, a communications problem that they could absolutely fix without running foul of the First Amendment. And something I'd like to see them do much better, to show accountability in the system more generally. People have to feel that it's there in addition to it actually being there. And a lot of that is communications.
On that note, I want to say if the four of you were running the country and all of the elections happening, we would be in a much better place. Thank you for sharing all this wisdom and insights. Thank you to those of you who were here today. We really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Okay, folks, why don't we get started? I want to welcome everybody here to this